Chapter 15 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 8. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 8, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 15, Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor. Both armies had marched during the night of the 7th and 8th under misapprehensions which were full of hope and encouragement. Lee, imagining that Grant was repeating the retrograde movement of Hooker, threw forward his right to cut off his enemy's retreat to Fredericksburg, while, on the other hand, when Grant, in the deepening night, rode with his staff in advance of Warren's corps behind Hancock's troops in position, and it was seen the line of march pointed to Richmond instead of Washington, the enthusiasm of the troops burst out in long and vociferous cheering. It was thought that the sanguinary struggle in the Wilderness was over, and that an honest fight on a fair field would soon give them the fruits of a victorious campaign. An equally bitter disillusion greeted both commanders on the morning of the 8th. Lee found that Grant was neither beaten nor retreating, and Grant, who had hoped to pass round the right wing of Lee so as to force a battle in the open or a race for Richmond, found, before the day ended, the whole army of Northern Virginia fortressed on the hills of Spotsylvania, directly in his path. He did not indeed recognize this unwelcome fact until afternoon, and had actually directed an order of march southward to be prepared before he was convinced that Lee was concentrated before him. The necessity of battle was not so strong here as at the Wilderness. General Humphrey says, quote, "Sufficiently good roads southward lay open to us on either side, by which, if we did not attack in front, we could have moved to turn either flank." Unquote. But Grant's genius was essentially offensive. If the advantages of fighting or not fighting were evenly balanced, he was sure to fight. He determined to attack Lee in position, and at least twice during the week of battles that followed, his furious assaults came so near to overwhelming success that most military critics have been led to justify his resolution. It was 8:30 on the morning of the 8th before Warren's advance made its way through the dense woods, impeded at every step by the gallant resistance of Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry, to the more open ground of Alsop's, about 2½ miles from the courthouse, and from that point there was continuous and heavy fighting for a mile to the forks of the Brock and Old Courthouse roads, when the Union troops came upon the entrenched division of Kershaw, and made no further progress. The Sixth Corps, under Sedgwick, came up later, on Warren's left, and both these able commanders were ordered to attack. It was, however, late in the day, there was no adequate time for preparation, the ground was absolutely new, and the attack failed. Both sides passed the night in strengthening their positions. The next day Hancock went into position on the right. Beyond the work of entrenching, little was done on the 9th except that there was a hot fire of skirmishers and sharpshooters, in the course of which General Sedgwick was killed. A soldier of tried valor and merit, as modest and amiable as he was intelligent and brave. General Horatio G. Wright, an officer of the same high character, succeeded him in command of the Sixth Corps. Burnside's corps came up on the extreme left, and for still another day the work of entrenching and observation went on. On the Confederate side, the entrenchments defended by the corps of Longstreet, commanded by R. H. Anderson, Ewell, and Hill, commanded by Early, stretched from left to right in an irregular semicircle, from the Blockhouse Bridge over the Po on the left to Snell's Bridge over the same river on the right, with a bold salient jutting out a mile to the north. It was a line of extraordinary strength. The works were almost everywhere concealed by a scrubby growth of brush. Lines of access were broken by ragged ravines bristling with artillery. in the judgment of the most dispassionate of critics, quote, "The strength of an army sustaining attack was more than quadrupled, provided they had force enough to man the entrenchments well." Unquote. Yet against this triple line of tangled thicket, of massive earthworks, and of brave men, Grant resolved to throw his utmost strength, confident that if he could once break it, his summer's task would be virtually accomplished. There was a moment, indeed, in which it had seemed possible that the left flank of this formidable position might be turned, and Lee driven out of it without the enormous cost which subsequently became necessary. Hancock crossed the Po on the evening of the 9th, and gained a position which constituted, General Early says, quote, "a very threatening danger," unquote, to Lee's left, completely enfilading it, and commanding the line of the Confederate communications to their rear. But on the morning of the 10th, Grant concluded to strike in front, and ordered Hancock to withdraw his troops from the south side of the Po, and to arrange a vigorous attack in company with Warren at 5 o'clock. Gibbon and Birney were therefore withdrawn, and later Barlow, in retiring under orders, was furiously attacked by Heth's division of Hill's corps. Barlow made a gallant fight, repulsing every attack made on him, and recrossing the river in admirable order under a destructive fire. This apparent victory gave great encouragement to the Confederates, who, of course, could not know that Barlow was retiring under imperative orders. In the afternoon the conditions for assault seemed so favorable that the attack was made a little earlier than had been ordered. Warren, with 3 divisions, tore through the obstacles in front of him, and his troops, with splendid bravery, although disordered by their struggle through the dense woods, reached the entrenchments, only to be swept away by the murderous fire. Some were killed even in the enemy's works. The gallant General James C. Rice fell in this assault. The attack was renewed 2 hours later, with perfect spirit, 2 divisions of Hancock joining, but with equal ill fortune. The Sixth Corps assaulted at the same time, and, having the advantage of better ground, was at first brilliantly successful. The storming party, led by Colonel Emory Upton, a young officer of the finest education and most daring courage, struck the west side of the McCool salient, the Bloody Angle, which jutted out nearly a mile beyond the main Confederate line, with such compactness and energy that it poured over the parapet, unchecked by a terrible fire in front and flank, and after a desperate grapple, hand to hand, broke the Confederate line, capturing many prisoners right and left, and pushing forward, seized the second line of entrenchments with its guns. If the supporting column had been on the ground ready to pour through the opening Upton had made, the damage to the Confederates would have been irreparable. But Mott's division had been so roughly handled in its advance that it failed to arrive in time. Upton's men, unwilling to give up their splendid prize, held the salient under heavy assaults from both sides, but retired at last under orders about nightfall. Upton was promoted brigadier general next day. He had most worthily won his stars. Colonel Carroll shared the same honor soon after. They were brought up to receive the personal thanks and compliments of the lieutenant general, both of them bandaged and pale from loss of blood. The day was notable for successes almost achieved. As we have seen, General Hancock turned the Confederate left in the morning, and then was ordered to draw off his troops. Upton broke their center, but for lack of support had to be withdrawn, and Burnside, who commanded the Union left wing, completely turned Lee's right, while the assault on the front was going on, but neither he nor Grant being conscious of the advantage acquired. Burnside was ordered to connect with Wright, and the position, so easily gained, was thus lost. The 11th passed by in inactivity. The nature of the ground was so unfavorable for offensive operations that General Lee wisely refrained from them, and Grant was busily preparing for the supreme effort of the campaign, the second assault of the McCool salient. He had not met either at the Wilderness or at Spotsylvania with all the success which he had anticipated. He had been forced to fight upon ground chosen by the enemy, under circumstances so unfavorable to himself as to neutralize all the advantage of his superior numbers. His magnificent artillery had been rendered so useless to him that he at last sent his entire reserve of that formidable arm back to Washington. After 6 days of slaughter, he could as yet point to no substantial result of so much labor and blood. But these circumstances, incomparably more discouraging than those to which Hooker had so promptly succumbed, did not daunt for an instant the indomitable heart of Grant. His intellect as well as his temperament naturally rejected the gloomy view of things. He wrote to Halleck on the morning of the 11th of May, quote, "We have now ended the 6th day of very hard fighting. The result up to this time is much in our favor." Unquote. He is frank as to his heavy losses, but thinks those of the enemy must be greater. He ends his first paragraph with the famous phrase, quote, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." Unquote. There is not a word of boasting or of complaint. He wants all the reinforcements the government can send, and they, quote, "will be very encouraging to the men." Unquote. At the close of his dispatch, his peculiar trait asserts itself of looking away from the condition of his own army and surmising the distress of his adversary, a faculty, we have seen, impossible to McClellan and others. Quote, "I am satisfied," he says, "the enemy are very shaky, and are only kept up to the mark by the greatest exertions on the part of their officers, and by keeping them entrenched in every position they take." Unquote. Even if this impression was somewhat exaggerated, it was far more conducive to coolness and activity than McClellan's fault of multiplying the force of an enemy till, quote, "the nodding of their plumes fanned him in despair." Unquote. On the afternoon of the 11th, Grant made preparations for an assault at the apex of the salient by Hancock's troops at dawn the next morning. Little was even yet known of the enemy's works or of the country between them, but there was some open ground north of the salient, and a line drawn on his imperfect map from Brown's farmhouse in the Union line to one within the rebel works was the direction for attack. In a drenching rain Hancock concentrated his troops, Barlow on the left, Birney on the right, and waited for the dawn, which came slowly, heavy and thick with fog and showers. It was 4:35 before there was light enough to march by. Hancock gave the order to advance, and the men rushed forward to the earthworks which loomed portentously through the mist. Shouting and cheering, they tore away the abatis with their hands and poured like a breaking wave over the parapet. Barlow and Birney were over almost at the same instant. There was scant room for firing. A fierce bayonet fight took place, but the hand-to-hand grapple could not last long. Edward Johnson's whole division of Ewell's corps was captured, General Johnson and Brigadier General George H. Stuart being among the prisoners. Hancock's victorious troops swept down the reverse of the entrenchments, through the woods, nearly a mile toward Spotsylvania, until they struck a strong line of works running east and west across the base of the salient, the existence of which had been hitherto unknown. These were heavily manned. Their possession was vital to Lee's army. He hurried reinforcements to this point from every hand, and soon checked Hancock's troops, who were somewhat disorganized by their victory and their hot pursuit, and in turn forced them back to the works they had first taken. But here they stood fast. They established themselves on both sides of the apex of the salient, and could not be dislodged. One of the most furious battles of the war raged all day about this bloody angle. The opposing flags were planted again and again on either side of the breastworks. Men were killed by bayonet thrusts over the logs. Prisoners were pulled over on both sides. Occasionally a white flag would be shown, and a few rebels would leap the barrier and surrender to get out of the deadly hail of bullets. The thickets were withered by the fire. Large trees were cut down by the missiles. The dead piled upon each other. The trenches had to be cleared of them more than once. Wright was ordered to the support of Hancock. He was wounded in his advance, but kept the field all day, and his corps fought side by side with the second until nightfall. North and South never proved their essential brotherhood more magnificently. There was no especial advantage of position, no skill of tactics brought into play. They both fought to kill. with undaunted spirit, from the first flush of dawn, through the misty morning, the dull, rainy day, to the black night. On the right, Warren, with the Fifth Corps, pushed forward his skirmish line and opened with his artillery. He found the works in his front so strongly held by Longstreet's corps, under Anderson, that he thought it imprudent to assault them. He reported this, but his report was taken ill by General Grant, who ordered him at 9:15 to attack with his whole force. He did so and met with a severe repulse. Humphreys, who saw the attack could not succeed, gave orders for it to cease, and had the troops transferred to the center to assist in operations there. On the left, Burnside also attacked with great energy. General Potter's division carried the intrenchments held by the left of Hill's corps under Early, but could not hold them in face of the fresh troops which were at once hurried up to retake them. In all the corps, the casualties were heavy, the total amounting to 6,000 killed and wounded. Hancock suffered the greatest loss, over 2,000 men, Warren and Wright about 1,000 each, and Burnside more. The Confederate loss is matter of conjecture and estimate, as it was never reported, but General Humphreys puts it at between 9,000 and 10,000 killed, wounded, and prisoners, which would make their killed and wounded about the same as those of the national forces. Their loss in general officers was especially severe. E. Johnson and Stewart captured, Junius Daniel and Abner Perrin killed, and James A. Walker, S. D. Ramseur, R. D. Johnston, and Samuel McGowan seriously wounded. On the Union side, Wright, Alexander S. Webb, and Samuel S. Carroll were wounded. It is hard to compute upon which side was the advantage of all this toil and carnage. Still it would seem that the greater proportionate damage fell to Lee. His material losses were harder for him to make good, and the holding of the salient was to Grant the moral trophy of victory. In the night the Confederates abandoned the attempt to regain the angle of death, and fell back to the inner line, 3/4 of a mile in the rear, where, in turn, they stood defiant of attack. Grant, telephoning to Halleck on the evening of the 12th an account of his harvest of prisoners on this, "8th day of battle," said, "The enemy are obstinate and seem to have found the last ditch." The next day General Grant was called upon to choose whether he would move by the right or left flank. If he moved by the right, Lee would have been forced to abandon his intrenchments and fall back to the North Anna. As this was not desired, the move to the left was decided upon. It was hoped that a blow might be struck at Lee's right flank before his intrenchments were extended further in that direction, and to this end Warren and Wright were ordered to move during the night of the 13th to Burnside's left. Warren was to attack at daylight of the 14th, and Wright to go in on his left. But, as so often happened in this campaign, more was demanded of the men than was physically possible. The night was dark as pitch, a heavy rain fell, turning the roads to mire, impassable unless corduroyed. In spite of the most intelligent precautions and the most arduous efforts on the part of the commanders, the head of the column could not be brought through the sea of mud to the point where they were to attack before 6 o'clock, and the command could not be got ready for work that day. There was a sharp skirmish on the Union left for the possession of a hill in Wright's front, which the National forces at last held and fortified. But the day was lost, and the movement, which with ordinary weather should have succeeded, failed. By the morning of the 15th the enemy had shifted his troops from his left to his right, and had strongly entrenched himself in front of the new Union lines. The stormy weather prevented active operations for more than a week. Grant on the 16th wrote reporting, "5 days almost constant rain without any prospect yet of it clearing up. Roads impassable. All offensive operations necessarily cease until we can have 24 hours of dry weather." But he says the army is in the best of spirits, that hostilities are suspended only by the weather, and not through exhaustion or weakness of the national army. During these days of delay some reinforcements arrived, but they were not so numerous as has sometimes been pretended. The estimated force sent to the Army of the Potomac, between the 4th of May and the 12th of June, was not equal to the casualties in battle, and during this time some 36 regiments were mustered out and discharged, by expiration of their term of service. General Lee also received very considerable reinforcements during his retrograde movement from the Rapidan to the James, Beauregard having driven Butler back from before Richmond, R.F. Hoke not being needed in North Carolina, and the force with which Breckinridge had defeated Sigel in the Valley being set free to join Lee. The Army of Northern Virginia received the valuable addition of some 15,000 veteran troops, thoroughly inured to war and with the prestige and morale of recent victory. General Grant, before continuing his movement by the left towards Richmond, made one final assault, on the morning of the 18th, upon the works at the base of the salient, which had now become Lee's left flank. Though made with vigor and energy by the veterans of the 2nd and 6th Corps, and assisted by a strong demonstration on Burnside's front, it was unsuccessful. The works had been so strengthened, and were so well defended that the Union forces lost heavily and inflicted little damage on the other side. The 18th was altogether a gloomy day for Grant. From every quarter came news of reverses. Butler had been defeated at Drury's Bluff. Sigel had been badly whipped in the Valley. Banks had met with disaster in Louisiana. His plan of concerted movement along the line was not resulting as favorably as he had hoped, but he wasted not a moment in regrets. As soon as the attack on Lee's left had failed, he issued orders for a movement by the left flank to be begun the next night. But before this movement commenced, Lee, with singular intuition, suspected it, and in order to make sure, he sent Ewell with a force of 6,000 men to make an attack on Grant's right. He struck Tyler's division of raw recruits about 5:30 on the Fredericksburg road. A sharp fight ensued. Hancock and Warren sent over some of their troops, and Ewell was severely repulsed, losing nearly 1,000 men. Early's corps had been held ready to cooperate in case Ewell's attack should be successful, but the latter having been compelled to retire, Early's movement was given up. This action, lasting until 9 o'clock, delayed the movement to the left which had been ordered for that night, but the orders were repeated the next day, and on the night of the 20th, Hancock moved out with the Second Corps and pushed by daybreak as far as Guiney Station. His cavalry under General A.T.A. Torbert cleared the way before him, fighting and capturing some prisoners on the way, to Milford Bridge across the Mattapony. Barlow's division was across the river and strongly entrenched by midday. The rest of the army swiftly followed, but nothing escaped the vigilance of Lee. Early in the morning he telegraphed to Richmond that the enemy was apparently changing his base, and that he was himself extending on the Telegraph Road. It was General Grant's hope that Lee, on discovering Hancock's isolated position, might leave his entrenchments to attack him. In that case, Grant would follow closely with the other 3 corps and try to get a battle out of Lee in the open field. But Lee did nothing of the kind, and General Grant in his Memoirs rather inconsistently criticizes him for not having done what he avowedly wished him to do. Considering that Lee had lost almost as heavily as Grant in the last terrible fortnight, and that while the Union loss amounted to a third of the army with which the campaign opened, 37,335 is the dreadful total of losses, according to General Humphreys, at the Wilderness and Spotsylvania, that of the Confederates, if it approached the same total, deprived them of half their force, General Lee cannot justly be reproached for a lack of enterprise in declining a battle in the open field on any conditions he was likely to be offered. It must be said he acted wisely in availing himself of the interior line open to him, and in proceeding with the utmost celerity by the Telegraph Road, to plant himself on a position where he could once more, with all his skill as an engineer and a topographer, bar the way to Richmond in the face of his formidable adversary. On the other hand, Humphreys admits with his usual candor that the circuitous route pursued by the Union army, several miles longer than that which was left to Lee, was an error. If Hancock had moved by the Telegraph Road, a collision in open ground might have been brought about before Lee could entrench in new ground. So late as the morning of the 22nd, General Lee, who had then arrived at Hanover Junction, does not seem to have ascertained the purpose or the whereabouts of Grant. He thought him at that time east of the Mattapony, but later in the same day his cavalry brought him news that the whole Army of the Potomac was west of that river, and he immediately disposed his force to meet Grant on the banks of the North Anna. Although no great battle was fought there, it will probably be considered by military students that both the opposing generals made exhibition on the banks of that little river of their most characteristic qualities. The story can be briefly told. Warren, commanding the Union right, crossed at Jericho Mills on the 23rd and was furiously attacked by A. P. Hill, who had recovered his health and resumed command of his corps. Warren, in a sharp fight, repulsed the enemy and took up a strong position which he soon made impregnable. Hancock carried the works on the north side of the stream, which covered the railroad and telegraph bridges, and the next morning crossed over and established himself firmly on the other side. Burnside, who was to cross at Oxford, in the center, found Lee's army in force on the south side, and could do nothing there. His force was divided, a portion joining Warren above, and another portion Hancock below. The situation was one of the gravest peril to Grant. His two wings, both south of the river, were separated by Lee's army, which occupied a formidable position on the river bank, with its flanks perfectly protected by marsh and thicket. If Lee had chosen to attack either detachment of his enemy, he might have thrown his whole force upon a given point in 1/3 of the time which it would have taken Grant to reinforce one wing by the other. There was not only the distance of 6 miles between them, but a river to be twice crossed. But the result of a defeat would have been to Lee so disastrous that he will not perhaps be blamed for excessive caution in this instance, especially in view of the defeat which Warren had inflicted upon Hill. Grant was, however, completely checkmated. Lee's position was too strong to assault, so he coolly resolved to recross the river and continue his flank march to the left. Grant accomplished the difficult and delicate task of recrossing the river under the very eyes of the enemy with extraordinary ability and success, and set off upon his usual flank march to the left, without the slightest apparent feeling of chagrin or disappointment. He announced his intention in a dispatch of the 26th of May, which is full of character. After describing the relative positions of the two armies, he said, quote, "To make a direct attack from either wing would cause a slaughter of our men that even success would not justify. To turn the enemy by his right between the two Annas is impossible, on account of the swamp upon which his right rests." Unquote. On his left there were 3 difficult streams to be crossed. He therefore determined to cross at Hanover Town. He wished his base of supplies changed from Port Royal to the White House. The tone of his dispatch was something to which the government had never been accustomed from that region. Quote, "Lee's army," he said, "is really whipped. The prisoners we now take show it, and the action of his army shows it unmistakably. A battle with them outside of our intrenchments cannot be had. Our men feel that they have gained the morale over the enemy, and attack him with confidence. I may be mistaken, but I feel that our success over Lee's army is already assured. The promptness and rapidity with which you have forwarded reinforcements has contributed largely to the feeling of confidence inspired in our men, and to break down that of the enemy." Unquote. Nothing like this had ever been before received from a commander of the Army of the Potomac. A man was now in charge of affairs who respected the government behind him more than the enemy in front. Grant hardly hoped at this time to interpose his army between Lee and Richmond, but he did expect to hold him so far to the west as, quote, "to reach the James River high up." Unquote. He put his army in motion on the night of the 26th of May, and the next day his advance under Sheridan crossed the Pamunkey River at Hanover Town, some 32 miles by the shortest route from his camp on the North Anna. The rest of the army got over the next day, but it was only to find the army of Lee awaiting them on the banks of the Totopotomoy, a creek which flows into the Pamunkey below Hanover Town. It is claimed in behalf of Lee that he had no desire to detain Grant on the Pamunkey, as that would have enabled him to reinforce Butler and take Richmond from the south. He therefore preferred to hold Grant on the Totopotomoy, so that, being nearer to Richmond, Lee might observe the whole field more intelligently and secure a readier cooperation of all his forces. Heavy skirmishing on the 29th and 30th showed that the two armies were once more face to face. Lee with his three corps, A.P. Hill's, Longstreet's, commanded by Anderson, and Ewell's, for the moment commanded by Early, lay entrenched on a line from Atlee's on the Central Road almost to Cold Harbor. Warren held the Union left on the Shady Grove Road, then came Burnside, Hancock, and Wright, who was about 6 miles southeast of Hanover Courthouse. Sheridan, with 2 divisions of cavalry, observed the left front towards Cold Harbor. J. H. Wilson, with 1 cavalry division, was operating on the Union right. The first fight was to be for the possession of Cold Harbor. In this, W. F. Smith's force, which had been ordered north of the James, was to join. As a great part of General Butler's force was now to unite with the Army of the Potomac, this is the most convenient place to survey briefly what his work had been in the eventful 3 weeks, during which the long and terrible battle had been drifting from the Rapidan to the Chickahominy. It was not General Grant's desire that the force, which was to cooperate with him by an advance upon Richmond from Fort Monroe, should be commanded by General Butler in person. He would have preferred that Butler should remain in command of the department, and that General William F. Smith, who had won his favor by his admirable services at Chattanooga, should have direction of this important column. But as Butler naturally insisted upon his claim to the immediate command of his own troops, Grant yielded his preference in the matter. His orders were general, though extremely clear. Butler was informed that Richmond was his objective. He was to move on City Point on the 5th, entrench and concentrate, and operate on Richmond from the south side of the river. If Lee should fall back before Richmond, Butler was to unite with Grant. If he were to invest Richmond from the south, so that his left could rest on the James, the junction of the two armies was to take place there, and in case the Army of the Potomac should approach from that quarter, Butler was to attack vigorously, and either carry the city or assist Grant by detaining a large force of the enemy on that side. He had a fine army under his orders, the 10th Corps, commanded by General Gillmore, who at his own request had been ordered up from South Carolina, and the 18th under W. F. Smith, in all 6 excellent divisions, numbering in the aggregate some 32,000 men under able generals, and 3,000 cavalry under A. V. Kautz. Grant had, with his usual indifference to personal considerations, given Butler, of whom he was not fond, the opportunity of striking the great coup of the war, while he himself was engaged in a desperate struggle with Lee's army on the Rapidan. Butler made his landing at Bermuda Hundred without opposition, and his troops on the 6th of May entrenched themselves on a line 3 miles long, stretching from Port Walthall on the Appomattox to Trent's Reach on the James. Smith held the right, Gillmore the left. Richmond and Petersburg were at this time very feebly garrisoned. Beauregard had been put in charge of the defense, and was straining every nerve to bring troops to the rescue. But when Butler moved, and for a week thereafter there was no adequate force either in Richmond or Petersburg, if those places had been vigorously attacked, Butler acted with unaccountable slowness. From the 7th to the 9th nothing of importance was accomplished, except that on the last of these days 6 miles of the Richmond and Petersburg Railroad immediately in front of his lines was destroyed, and Kautz, with his cavalry, did considerable damage to the Weldon Road. General Butler was so well satisfied with this that when on the evening of the 9th Gillmore and Smith proposed to him to cross the Appomattox and capture Petersburg, he refused his consent to the movement. Day by day Beauregard strengthened himself and posted his reinforcements at the points where they were most needed, so that when at last, on the 14th, Butler moved out against the enemy at Drury's Bluff, he found him in powerful intrenchments, heavily manned, in force nearly equal to his own. A great and justifiable anxiety had prevailed in Richmond for 9 days. When Butler landed at City Point, both Petersburg and the Confederate capital were almost defenseless. Not more than 6,000 men could be found to man the works. The dispatches between the rebel War Office and Pickett, and afterwards Beauregard, are full of panic. So late as the 10th, Seddon says, quote, "This city is in hot danger, It should be defended with all our resources, to the sacrifice of minor considerations." Unquote. The situation was in fact of the gravest character, with Lee grappling in a life and death struggle on the Spotsylvania hills, with Sheridan breaking to pieces the renowned Confederate cavalry, with Butler at their gates on the head of an army which Grant thought should have taken Richmond with a single rush. It was a time for supreme exertions, but General Beauregard would have been untrue to himself if he had let pass so fine an opportunity for controversy with his superiors. In the midst of this imperative crisis, he laid before General Bragg, his commanding general, an elaborate plan, the main features of which were that Lee should fall back before Grant to the Chickahominy, that he should then send Beauregard 15,000 men, with which reinforcement Beauregard would destroy Butler, and then take his whole army to Lee and destroy Grant. They must concentrate or starve, he urged. This plan would but anticipate what must ultimately be done. There is a direct contradiction between Bragg and Beauregard as to the manner in which these suggestions were received. Beauregard insists that Davis and Bragg both received them favorably, and although they could not venture to withdraw troops from Lee at such a time, they reinforced Beauregard with 5,000 men and enabled him to attack Butler, while Bragg, in a memorandum dated the 19th, severely condemns the whole plan on the ground that it would involve such delay as to exhaust their subsistence, that it would allow the enemy to strengthen himself by entrenching, that it would involve the fall of Petersburg, that a retreat of 60 miles by General Lee might destroy his army, that it would abandon a territory rich in stores, that it would lose the Valley of Virginia and the Central Railroad, and finally, that it was unnecessary, as Beauregard had already a force of 23,000 men, enough to whip Butler if properly handled. Beauregard was therefore sharply enjoined to attack. Delay, Mr. Seddon urged, would be fatal. Quote, "By Wednesday our fate will in all probability be settled." Unquote. The Confederate authorities had used the most strenuous exertions to bring troops to Richmond. The answers of some of their generals to their appeals show the strain to which they were subjecting their resources. General Samuel Jones, having been ordered to send a brigade from Florida, says he will obey, but adds with a simplicity which is full of ominous meaning, quote, "I greatly doubt if one half of the men ordered will leave Florida, and my order will cause desertions and disorganizations." Unquote. General Beauregard, having refreshed himself with his customary dispute with the Richmond officials, prepared to attack Butler energetically on the morning of the 16th. Butler's forward movement had not only been brought to impotence by the heavy force and the strong entrenchments he had given his adversary the leisure to accumulate across his path at Drury's Bluff, he had also made a faulty disposition of his line, leaving his right unguarded and open to easy approach from the river road. Beauregard's object was, attacking by that side to cut him off from Bermuda Hundred and capture or destroy him. Ransom was turned to his right, Hoke to attack in the center, Colquitt being held in reserve, while Whiting was to come up from Petersburg and strike the rear or left flank. This plan, well combined as it was, had only a partial success. A dense fog confused the movements of both sides. It gave Ransom the opportunity to strike Smith's right by surprise, and to capture General C. A. Heckman and a portion of his brigade. But his front withstood successfully all the assaults made upon it, and Gilmore was able not only to repulse Hoke's attack upon him, but also to send help to Smith. The morning wore on in a blundering series of movements and orders made and countermanded as the fog lifted and fell. Beauregard did not pursue with any effectiveness his early advantage on the right, yet Butler was so impressed by the menace to his rear that he at last ordered Smith to fall back and Gilmore to keep in connection with him, until about noon they both established themselves firmly across the turnpike and the roads east of it, and kept that position the rest of the day. Whiting took no part in the battle. He was checked by Ames's division at the Walthall Junction, 6 miles to the south, and as often happened in the course of the war, from atmospheric conditions and the direction of the wind, hearing no sound of the fight, and receiving erroneous news of an advance from City Point, he fell back to Swift Creek. It was night before he received Beauregard's order to aid in the advance, dated at 4:15, and he replied that the hour was too late for him to act. A furious rainstorm came on in the afternoon, and at night Butler fell back to Bermuda Hundred. Beauregard reported a loss in this engagement of 2,184. That of Butler was 3,500, of which 1,400 were prisoners, the killed and wounded being almost exactly equal. But the substantial victory was, of course, with Beauregard, though he did not accomplish all he had hoped. He had saved Richmond for the time, and had shut up Butler in his entrenchments between the two rivers, "as a bottle strongly corked." The news of the fruitless ending of the campaign south of the James came to Grant on the 22nd of May, while he was moving south from Spotsylvania, and, accepting the situation with his usual decision, he ordered Butler to keep only enough of his army to hold his works, and to send the rest under Smith to join the Army of the Potomac. They began to arrive at the White House about noon on the 30th of May. Beauregard had already received similar orders from Richmond, and Pickett joined Lee at Hanover Junction, while Hoke's division came up in time for Cold Harbor. There was a sharp collision on the 31st between Sheridan and Fitzhugh Lee on the Union extreme left for the possession of Cold Harbor, an important point, as it was the center of a network of roads leading to the bridges of the Chickahominy. The enemy received an infantry reinforcement late in the day, but Sheridan held fast, and in the night turned the breastworks he had captured against the Confederates, and in the morning was relieved by Smith's command. Wright also got up in the afternoon of the 1st of June, and at 6 o'clock he and Smith advanced upon the enemy's works, which crossed the road between Cold Harbor and New Cold Harbor. The first line was carried in fine style, though with severe loss in men, and especially in valuable officers, and both corps at once entrenched the positions they had gained. During this attack there was heavy skirmishing between the corps not engaged and the enemy opposite them. The next day was spent in getting the troops into position for an assault of the enemy's works in force. Lee, observing the movement to the left, sent Early to strike the Union right flank, which effort met with a severe repulse, in which the Confederate General George Doles was killed. The attempt to break through the enemy's entrenchments on the 3rd of June failed so disastrously, it had been so unsparingly condemned by military critics, and so candidly acknowledged to be an error by General Grant himself, that we are apt to lose sight of the motive which prompted it. The right and left wings of Lee were unassailable from the nature of the ground. The front only appeared possible to attack. Grant was unwilling to go to the south side of the James without one more attempt to accomplish the purpose with which he had opened the campaign, to destroy Lee's army north of Richmond. If he had succeeded at Cold Harbor, he might have achieved that great result. He knew the task was difficult. It proved to be impossible. He inflicted upon the heroic Army of the Potomac one of its most terrible defeats, as he says himself, "without compensation." There was no lack of energy or soldiership in the assault. The army never rushed to battle with more splendid ardor than in the early dawn of the 3rd of June. Hancock, Wright, and Smith sent their veterans forward at the hour named with an impulse which would have been irresistible if the work assigned them had been possible. In the Second Corps, Barlow, advancing under a withering fire, actually seized a portion of the works, capturing a color, some guns, and prisoners. But it was not possible to stay under the rain of musketry and the enfilading fire of artillery concentrated on them by Breckinridge and Hill. They were forced out again, though they retired less than 75 yards, and entrenched themselves under a destructive fire. Gibbon's force was cut in two by an impassable swamp, which widened as it approached the enemy. His severed division advanced gallantly. However, young Colonel James P. McMahon, mounting the breastworks with a few of his men, and falling dead in the enemy's hands beside his colors. Wright's corps went forward with equal spirit, carrying the enemy's rifle pits and assaulting the main line unsuccessfully and with heavy loss, but retiring only a few yards and entrenching themselves. Smith, with the 18th Corps, also did all that brave men could do. His divisions were torn to rags in their assault. Several times the attack, repulsed by a fire which may fitly be called infernal, was renewed, until General Grant, learning from all his corps commanders that they were not sanguine of success, ordered the attack to cease. Burnside and Warren meanwhile had been demonstrating on the right. Burnside captured some of the enemy's rifle pits, and Warren repulsed a vigorous attack of John B. Gordon. But the nature of the ground in front of them prevented any advance. At night, the two armies lay so close together that their pickets were continually coming into collision, and the officers on both sides reported themselves attacked by the enemy. The day's loss on the Union side was frightful, considering the short time the troops were actually engaged, between 5,000 and 6,000. And even these appalling figures do not give an adequate idea of the damage done. The men destroyed were of the flower of the Army of the Potomac, inured to the service by years of march and battle. The valor with which they were led was proved by the list of brigade and regimental commanders who fell in the desperate charge. In Barlow's division, Colonels Richard Barnes and Orlando H. Morris were killed, and John R. Brooke wounded. In Gibbon's, General Robert O. Tyler was severely wounded. Henry B. McKean, another brigade commander, was killed. His place was taken by Colonel Frank A. Haskell, who was killed a few minutes later. McMahon's heroic death has been already mentioned, and Colonel Peter A. Porter, a gentleman of the finest strain, in breeding and in character, was another among the 65 officers lost in this single division. The 18th Corps lost on the 1st and 3rd 4 regimental commanders, Fred F. Weed, Edgar Perry, Hiram Anderson, Jr., and Marshall. The loss of the Confederate side was small. Standing safely within their impregnable entrenchments, they slaughtered their assailants at their leisure. It was the useless carnage of Marye's Hill repeated in the same way. General Grant had followed the example of some of his predecessors, and given General Lee a victory gratis. In his memoirs, written with the candor and conscience of a man in the presence of death, he deals himself this just and severe sentence, quote, "I have always regretted that the last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made. No advantage whatever was gained to compensate for the heavy loss we sustained. Indeed, the advantages, other than those of relative losses, were on the Confederate side. Before that, the Army of Northern Virginia seemed to have acquired a wholesome regard for the courage, endurance, and soldierly qualities generally of the Army of the Potomac. They seemed to have given up any idea of gaining any advantage of their antagonist in the open field. They had come to much prefer breastworks in their front to the Army of the Potomac. This charge seemed to revive their hopes temporarily, but it was of short duration. The effect upon the Army of the Potomac was the reverse. When we reached the James River, however, all effects of the Battle of Cold Harbor seemed to have disappeared." Unquote. There was perhaps a compensation for this disaster, which General Grant does not mention. It made him always thereafter careful and economical of his soldiers' blood. From the 3rd of June to the end of the war, he never wasted a life. By the 5th of June he had thought out the problem before him, and was ready to act, and his action was in the highest degree characteristic. He did not, like his predecessor in defeat on that same ground, turn and rail at the government for his disaster, and ask for impossible reinforcements. He accepted with manly fortitude the partial failure of his plan of campaign. He had hoped to disable Lee north of Richmond. Finding this impracticable, he now determined to assail that city and its communications from the south. He made known his intentions to General Halleck in a dispatch of remarkable clearness and strength. Quote, "A full survey of all the ground satisfies me that it would be impracticable to hold a line northeast of Richmond that would protect the Fredericksburg Railroad to enable us to use that road for supplying the army. My idea from the start has been to beat Lee's army, if possible, north of Richmond, then, after destroying his lines of communication on the north side of the James River, to transfer the army to the south side and besiege Lee in Richmond, or follow him south if he should retreat. I now find, after over 30 days of trial, the enemy deems it of the first importance to run no risks with the armies they now have. They act purely on the defensive behind breastworks, or feebly on the offensive immediately in front of them, and where, in case of repulse, they can instantly retire behind them. Without a greater sacrifice of human life than I am willing to make, all cannot be accomplished that I had designed outside of the city." Unquote. He then sets forth the plan he has adopted: to destroy the central road some 25 miles west of Beaver Dam, then to move to the south side of the James, to operate on the enemy's lines of supply. He concludes with these words, quote, "The feeling of the two armies now seems to be that the rebels can protect themselves only by strong entrenchments, whilst our army is not only confident of protecting itself without entrenchments, but that it can beat and drive the enemy wherever and whenever he can be found, without this protection." Unquote. These words are the key to his whole subsequent campaign. He threw away no more advantages from a spirit of hurry or of pugnacity. Realizing the full value of his enemy's works, he opposed his own to them henceforward, and in his constant effort to force his enemy to a point where he could fight him in the field, he stretched his line always to the left, till that of his adversary, in the attempt to follow, broke, and the Confederacy crumbled in instantaneous ruin. End of chapter 15. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois.